but she was cute. I'd do her, I thought. It was 4 a.m. before I could head home. I woke up about 11 a.m. the next morning. Both kids were up, but being quiet so I could sleep. They had made coffee and breakfast for me. All that was needed was putting it in the microwave to reheat it. While I was eating, my son said, "Dad, you're famous. There have been clips on the TV all morning of your news conference. They say you are the best detective around. Regular Sherlock Holmes." I was sort of proud that my son thought so highly of me, but I didn't want to let him down by failing to solve the crime. I was between the provable rock and a hard place. I started to explain when I was interrupted by the phone. Jenny answered, "It's for you." "Hello," I answered. "The chief has just called a meeting in 1 hour. Be there," my boss said. An hour later, I was sitting in the conference room at the police headquarters. "Gentlemen, we have a real problem. It seems as if the story of last night's shooting has hit the national news. So we are putting together a task force to solve this case. Like we did with the serial killer?" I asked sarcastically. "Shut up, Detective Holmes," was the reply I got. The rest of the day was spent setting up areas of responsibility. The feds and the state boys took everything they could. I listened to the turf battles and realized that there was nothing left for us locals. These guys wanted all the glory and would not share. Their goal was not to see justice served, but to claim glory for themselves. I excused myself to use the men's room. I never returned to the meeting. Later at home, I got a call from my captain, "A-hole. You left me there to listen to all that bullshit for 4 hours. Next time when you sneak out, take me with you." We both had a good laugh, and he said he'd update me tomorrow. I explained about the alarm system and I might be a little late. The alarm guys were right on time the next morning. I explained my needs and what they were dealing with. They listened politely and then explained what type of a system I was getting. When they got done, I realized that I was set up for the very best. My buddy had taken care of me. I got in the office about 2 hours later than I usually did. My captain called me into his office. There was a female patrol officer sitting there. "This is Detective Percy Holmes," he said as I sat down. "This is Patrol Officer Sharon Glenn. She just passed the detective test and got her gold shield. She's your new partner," he added. "I don't work with a partner anymore," I yelled. "You do now. And if you don't like it, resign," was his reply. He read off all her accomplishments. First in her class at the academy, highest test scores on the corporal and sergeant's exams, best arrest and conviction rate of anyone currently in uniform. On and on he went with her accomplishments. I had to admit it, I was impressed. "Did you tell her that my last 3 partners were killed in the line of duty?" I asked. "He did," she replied, speaking for the first time. She had a nice soft voice full of confidence. I looked at her and asked, "I want to meet your husband and children, so I can explain why you'll probably be dead within the next 2 years. She gave me a very hard look and said, "I'm divorced and have no children, detective." I guess I put my foot in my mouth again. I thought, so am I. Except that I'm divorced 3 times and have 2 children living with me and 1 with her mother in Oregon. I snapped. "That's enough children," yelled the captain. "Percy, bring her up to speed on the club shooting. Now both of you get out of my office." So began life with my new partner. Sharon and I were still working on our relationship. Me trying to bully her into requesting a new partner, her putting up with my bullshit. When the first of the crime scene reports finally showed up, the coroner's reports arriving first. The reports were sent directly to me, not the task force. I knew there would be hell to pay for that error, but I was glad to get my hands on them. I felt that the task force was not keeping an open mind on the case and had already pegged it as a drug-related shot-out. What bothered me was there were no hints of any troubles before this shooting and no retaliation shooting after. This wasn't normal for drug gangs. They always shot first and thought later. Like I said, this bothered me. Deep down inside, I felt that something was wrong with the drug war assumption. I picked up the first folder and started reading. The autopsy photos were not pleasant, but typical. I tossed them across to Sharon. She started looking at the photos of the first victim. About halfway through, she ran out of the office into the ladies' room. I smiled to myself at her distress. "You're not as tough as you think you are," I thought. She returned to her desk about half an hour later, looking very pale. To her credit, she picked up the next stack of photos. I guess she was a little tougher than I, though. We spent the rest of the morning going over the reports. When we got finished, something was bothering me about the results, but I couldn't figure out exactly what it was. Sharon and I dropped the stack of reports in the task force meeting room as we left the building. Sharon had done a pretty good job of keeping herself together, so I asked her if she wanted to have lunch with me. I told her I wanted to get her feelings on the reports. At the diner, I ordered a full lunch. Sharon just wanted tea. I guess her stomach was still a little upset. Between bites, I grilled her on her findings and opinions of the reports. She answered my questions with a great insight into the case. I was impressed. Maybe I was wrong in my first impression of her, I thought. Percy, I couldn't help but notice you were not affected by the photos, she commented softly. I guess you get used to all that violence over the years. No, you don't ever get used to it. You just develop a stronger stomach, was my only comment. We left and went back to the office. The captain warned me that Detective Holmes didn't want a partner and would try and get me to request a transfer. I don't know why he treated me like I was a rookie. He was the best detective on the force, and I was beside myself with happiness in being asked to be his partner. When the captain first introduced us, I saw a flash of sorrow in his eyes. But then he started. He yelled Timmy and the captain about all his former partners having been killed in the line of duty. The worst was when he asked my husband's name and if I had children because he wanted to inform them that I would be dead before his year passed. I was so pissed that I lashed out at him. After the captain tossed us out of his office, we went back to the squad room. Detective Holmes started going through the autopsy files for the case he was working on. He handed me a couple of the folders he had already looked at and told me to get up to speed on the case. I had never seen this type of explicit photography. After I had looked at a couple, my stomach gave up and I ran into the ladies' room. It took about 30 minutes before I could stop vomiting. After I got myself cleaned up, I returned to the squad room. I asked Detective Holmes for some or files to review. He gave me a funny look and handed over a few more. About an hour later, he suggested we stop for lunch. At the diner, the pig had a full meal while I could just about hold down some tea and dry crackers. He watched me while discussing the current case. I was able to keep my stomach still. When we got back to the squad room, he actually started asking my opinion on the case. He wasn't being condescending, but actually listening to my thoughts on the case. I felt proud of myself, but my stomach was still very bad. We finished our day, and Sharon left looking very upset. I wasn't feeling that good myself, but I've had years of practice hiding my feelings. I was cleaning off my desk when the phone rang. Detective Holmes, I answered. Goddamn, a civilized answer, said the voice on the other end. Hi, Your Honor. How are things in Oregon? I asked, recognizing her voice. Your son has been filling up my answering machine describing all the great things you have done for him, she said. Looks like you'll need to buy a bigger tape, I said smugly. She laughed. Percy, I'm going to be in Washington, D.C. attending a federally sponsored conference at the end of the month. I'd like to take a few extra days and see for myself exactly what you have done to this poor boy to make him so happy. We have a guest bedroom with a separate bathroom, I replied. We'd be honored if you would stay with us. I for one would like to meet you, and you could save the hotel costs. I'll email you my travel plans as soon as they are firmed up, she said. And I'd like to meet you also, she added. Maria had picked up her phone and called Percy. They were on the way to a first-name basis. She wanted to discuss the new house that Todd was so excited about, but she also wanted to send out some feelers about visiting them when she is at the judicial conference in D.C. She planned on maybe paying them a quick visit to see the house and maybe a family-style dinner somewhere. She was floored when Percy invited her to stay as long as she wanted and to use their spare bedroom to save hotel costs. She accepted and promised to send her itinerary. After they hung up, she realized that her heart was beating faster. What the hell was he doing to her? She thought. On the way home, I tried to decide if I should tell Todd or just surprise him. I made up my mind. I'd let him take his driving permit test. As for the rest, I was doing what I do best, procrastinate. Todd and I went to the motor vehicles office after school the next day. He almost aced the test. He only missed one question, and it wasn't a fair question. The driving booklet expressed all the important distances in car lengths. The test question wanted the answer in feet. He couldn't make the conversion, but he still left the office the proud owner of a driving permit. Of course, he was a typical teenager and asked, "Can I drive home?" "No," was my answer. "We need to let you practice in a safe place first. I'll see if I can get you on the police driving course over the weekend." I called the police driving instructor and asked permission the next day. "Percy, I'd be glad to let you in Saturday at 10 a.m. Needless to say, my son was thrilled when I told him. Saturday morning, Todd was up and ready to go by 8 o'clock. It was only a 30-minute drive to the driving course. Todd kept asking if it was time to leave yet, until I threatened to gag him. We were still at the course 30 minutes early. I found the driving instructor waiting for us. When I gave him a funny look, he said, "I had a teenage son once, you know?" My next surprise was when he got in a test car with my son and told me to go get coffee. I must have given him a funny look because he said, "Perk, I've ridden with you before. I'd like your son learn to drive the right way." I got in my car and drove to McDonald's for coffee. I wasn't going to buy him anything good after what he said. It took me about half an hour before I returned. My friend the instructor was standing by the edge of the track, watching my son drive. He looked at me and said, "Kid's doing pretty good already." My head swelled as any proud parents would. Then the clown added, "Todd's already doing better than you." I hope you choke on your coffee, I thought. He was having too much fun. The lesson lasted another 2 hours. Not because Todd wanted to quit, but because the instructor had plans for the rest of the day. I let Todd drive back to our home. We took the back roads to stay away from traffic. The invisible brake on the passenger side got a real workout for me on that trip. From that point on, Jenny or I had our personal driver anytime we needed to go out. Time passed. Sharon and I continued working on the club murder task force but started catching other cases. The task force was making no headway. They were too busy with their infighting to help each other. We caught a few easy cases. A husband killed by a jealous wife after a fight over his girlfriend, the shooting of a clerk during a robbery attempt, the shooting of a robber by a clerk after a robbery attempt. It was right after the clerk shooting and in the same neighborhood. Robberies decreased in that neighborhood for a while. One day during lunch, Sharon and I were joined by one of the local crime reporters. I suspected he wanted information on one of our cases. He was a nice guy and a straight shooter, so I let him join us. After the usual pleasantries, he asked, "Did you know one of the victims at the club shooting was the wife of a state senator?" "No, we didn't. I was told that all the victims were just scum or innocent bystanders," was my answer. "You're gonna love this," he said and began his tale. It seemed that a state senator named J. William Guido was in the process of divorcing his wife. It was a very nasty divorce. Both the husband and wife were carrying on affairs, him with an aide in his office, her with Drug King. I didn't recognize any important names from the case files. I said, "She was using her maiden name, Karen Simpson," he filled in. Sharon interrupted, "I remember her name. She was one of the victims at the table." I thanked the reporter and asked him to keep that little fact under his hat until I could check it out. We finished our lunch and went our separate ways. Sharon and I back to the squad room, and the reporter back to wherever reporters go. The first thing Sharon and I did was sneak the files on Karen Simpson out of the task force's office. Actually, we didn't need to sneak them out. The office was empty. The coroner's report on her showed she was shot and how many bullet wounds she had and their location. The CSI report gave us her location in the club and where she was seated at the table. The more I reread them, the more I had my doubts about the task force's reasoning that it was a gang-related killing. Karen had almost double the number of gunshot wounds as anyone else at the table, and she was sitting across the table from the Drug King. From my perspective, it looked as if she was the target, not the Drug King. For the first time since we had been partnered up, Sharon didn't question my theory. At the next task force meeting, Sharon brought up our theory. She was politely told to let the experts handle the case. The guys didn't notice, but I saw the smoke coming out of her ears. I took her hand under the table and squeezed hard. She got the hint and kept her mouth shut. Sharon was pissed. The task force had dismissed her theory as if she was a trainee. If it wasn't for Percy taking her hand under the table, she would have let those male chauvinists have it with both barrels. That was the first time Percy had treated me like a partner. I liked it. A couple of days later, we met the friendly reporter at an out-of-the-way diner for lunch. I explained about the task force's reaction to our theory. I told him that it was okay to print just the facts and not to mention Sharon or me as sources. He agreed way too quickly, so I figured he had another source. A week later, the story appeared under his byline on the front page. Needless to say, the shit hit the fan. The TV stations sent crews to interview the senator. The print media started asking all kinds of embarrassing questions to the task force. Sharon and I enjoyed the shit out of this mess. Of course, when asked, I explained that we were not active members of the task force and really couldn't comment on its activities. Sharon and I were officially dropped from the task force. Our captain was pissed because we were dropped, but there was nothing he could do about it. The press had a field day with the greatest detective in the area dropped from the task force. The task force moved their headquarters out of our area, effectively cutting the press off from them. Sharon liked her moment in the sun. I just went back to work. My son took his driver's test. He passed. I gave him his own set of keys to the car. About 6 months passed when I got a visit from Dean Beggy, the local police officer I had met when I first moved in. He asked if we could take a ride and talk. "I'm having a problem with a traffic accident where the driver was killed. I feel as if the accident was staged, but can't put my finger on how," he stated. I got in the car and we went for a ride. We visited the accident scene and walked the area. I tried to get a feeling for what had happened. The night of the accident, it was dark and rainy. The driver missed the curve, left the road, and hit a tree. He was going way too fast for the conditions that night. Our next stop was the police impound lot. The car was a crumpled wreck. If the impact didn't kill the driver, the fire afterward did. It looks as if it was just an accident, I commented. I thought so too, but what would a newspaper reporter be doing on that road at that time of the night? He just didn't belong there, was the answer I got. I looked at the dean and said, "What was his name?" I got my answer. It was the reporter who broke the news of Senator's wife being one of the victims at the club murders. I then brought my friend up to speed on the club murder case. I warned him to keep everything quiet because I really didn't know how far up this went. We stopped at a payphone and I called Sharon. I told her to go to a payphone and call me back on this payphone. When she called me back, I filled her in on the new information. She was very quiet when I got done. "Keep your gun handy," I told her. I was dropped off at my house. I cleaned my pistols and reloaded them. That night I gave the kids my strongest "don't talk to strangers" lecture. I must have impressed them because it was quiet around my house that night. I set the alarm system that night and rechecked it a couple of times before going to bed. Sharon was confused by Percy's request to call him from a payphone, but followed his instructions. She drove to a payphone and called him. Percy then explained all about the accident that took the reporter's life. She remembered the reporter from the lunch she had shared with him and Percy. By the time Percy got done telling her to be careful, she was scared a little. But when Percy told her from now on to keep her gun handy, she almost wet her pants. As Percy suspected, and she agreed, someone on the force was dirty. She started sleeping with one eye open. 2 months later, we were on a fresh homicide investigation. I was looking at the victim and Sharon was looking around the rural cabin. I was talking with the first patrol officers on the scene when Sharon said, "Perk, I'm going to look around the basement and see if I can pick up anything of interest." "Be careful, these old houses are death traps sometimes," I replied. She opened the old-fashioned outside cellar doors and disappeared into the darkness. Little did I know how soon I would be regretting those words. I went back to discussing the crime scene with the officers while we waited for the coroner and the CSI techs. I felt I would be of more help if I looked around the property and let Percy do the victim stuff. His stomach was stronger than mine. I told Percy I would start in the basement. I got his usual warning, this time about rickety old stairs and such. I didn't mention it to Percy, but I hated spiders as much as I did dead bodies. I started poking into things in the basement. Suddenly there was a bright flash. Percy didn't know exactly what happened, but suddenly there was a terrible explosion from the basement. The house collapsed into the basement. Everybody started digging out the basement trying to get to Sharon. My hands were bleeding, nails torn off, and my voice calling, "Sharon." All the patrol officers helped me dig because we knew time was of the essence. When we finally got the first floor lifted so I could crawl under it, I saw her. Her face was destroyed. There was nothing I could do for her. She was killed when part of the house collapsed on her. I lay in the dirt holding her body and started to cry. I had lost another partner. After they got me away from her body, they started digging her out. They were very respectful. She was one of them and deserved their respect. It really didn't make any sense. Why would this lowlife have that much explosive stored in his basement? And what set it off? The technicians could find no sign of a tripwire or timer to set it off. I walked up to the head tech and said, "Look really hard and be careful. I think this is related to the club murders." His jaw set, and he looked a little harder at me. "You sure?" he asked. I nodded and added, "I also think there's a dirty cop involved." His look got really tough. All cops hate a dirty cop, and if that dirty cop was from his area, the feelings are even higher. Before I left the crime scene, the coroner came up to me and said, "It appears that she died instantly. She had no idea it was coming. There was nothing you could have done to save her." I sat in the back of an ambulance while my hands were cleaned and bandaged. I made a promise to her that I'd get her killers if it was the last thing I did. I left the crime scene and drove home. When I arrived, I found my friend Dean, the local cop, parked in my driveway. He explained that he didn't want the kids bothered by any reporters. I thanked him and entered my house. I was met by 2 very scared kids. They heard about the explosion, but the TV was not making any comments. The only thing they were sure of was that I was okay because the police officer had told them. "Sharon was killed today by a blast at a crime scene we were working," I said softly. Maybe I should have broken it to them a little differently, but I am what I am. They both knew Sharon. They had met her, talked to her, went to functions with her. We were almost like a little family. I suspected that Jenny and Todd were hoping something might develop between Sharon and me so we could be a family. It was all shattered now. Jenny broke down and ran to her room. I didn't see her until the next morning. Sharon's funeral was hell. For 3 days, I stood at the side of her coffin in full dress uniform. It was a closed coffin because of the damage the blast did to her. Whenever someone asked me about the closed coffin, I relived the moment I saw her after being dug out of the rubble from the blast. I am tough, but not that tough. My eyes watered a lot. No, I hadn't fallen in love with her, but I had developed a bond that only partners working together could form. My fellow police officers knew this feeling, and most just shook my hand, and some of the female officers hugged me. There were members of all the local and surrounding police forces in attendance. The mayor and most of the city hall officials also paid their respects. It was their way of saying thanks for serving us. Sharon only had a few family members, and they were all distant relatives living in distant states. I was the closest thing she had to local family. I stood tall and stoic for Sharon, but I was torn up inside. Those 3 days went past in a blur. Finally, it was time to bury her. I was asked to accompany her body to the church and at the service. As the staff from the funeral home wheeled her out and into the hearse, I was asked to walk next to her. I put my hand on her coffin and cried. One of the local newspapers took a photo. It was on the front page of the morning paper under the caption, "The Last Ride for a Partner." At the church, the pallbearers, 100 volunteered, but only 8 were chosen, guided her up the center aisle to the front of the church. I walked alone behind the coffin. I tried to present a brave front, but the lump in my throat was choking me. Someone guided me to the front pew where my kids were sitting. I really don't remember much until I found myself standing at the cemetery listening to that terrible "asses to ashes" praise. Both of my kids were there with me when I broke down. I went to my knees. "Sharon," I said, "please forgive me. I tried to warn you that all my partners ended up dying, but you just wouldn't listen." My fellow officers were helping me back up on my feet when I felt more than saw my son, Todd, take off running through the crowd. He ran to a distinguished woman dressed in black. He started hugging her and pulling her toward me. I didn't recognize her, but she was important to Todd for some reason. I knew she wasn't my ex. Todd's mother was a blonde. So who was she? Jenny left my side and hurried over to Todd. I don't know what was said, but suddenly Jenny was hugging the mystery woman and started crying again. I guessed that she was one of Sharon's relatives. I was so very wrong. Maria heard about the explosion on the evening news. When she heard the victim was Percy's partner, Sharon, she knew the little family needed her support. Maria and Percy had become friends, calling each other a couple of times a month. She also knew that Percy had developed that special bond only partners could forge. She called the airline and made reservations for a flight out the next day. She also called her clerk and asked that all her appointments be canceled and explained why. Her last call was to her boss explaining why he needed to transfer her workload to another judge. It was a hectic trip, but she made it to the cemetery just in time to see Percy drop to his knees at the graveside, some of his fellow officers rushing to his aid. As she stood there and shook, she saw Todd rushing toward her, followed by a pretty young girl. So that's what Jenny looks like, she thought. Then she saw him, Percy, coming over to them. Her heart started beating a little faster the nearer he got. When he got there, she realized that he was holding it together by a thread. As Todd made the introduction, she reached out her arms and her heart to him. Percy arrived at that little group when his son said, "Dad, I want you to meet Judge Sanchez. She's my other mother." I found myself looking into a pair of very startling green eyes and the pretty face of a woman about my age. I started to say some stupid thing when my eyes started leaking again and that damn lump in my throat shut me up. She put out her arms and took me in them. There we stood in a group hug, just trying to merge into one strong individual. The 3 of them guided me back to the limo, and with the help of some of my friends, put me in the backseat. My kids and the judge joined me. We had a very quiet ride back. When the limo stopped and the door opened, I found that I was in front of my house. I started to protest because my car was at the funeral home, but my son just said, "Don't worry, Dad, I'll get it." And he took off with the driver. I was guided by Jenny and the judge into my house and up to my bedroom. The judge took off my shoes and dress uniform. "We'll talk later. Now you just need rest," she said and kissed me on the forehead. I slept until the next morning. I woke up smelling bacon cooking. It triggered my hunger. I got out of bed and put on some sweats and headed downstairs to the kitchen. I found the judge and the kids making breakfast. "Good morning, sleepyhead," was the greeting I got. It seemed that I had been sleeping over 12 hours. I was put in a chair at the table and poured a cup of coffee. They started serving breakfast and telling me what had happened since I decided to go into hibernation. It seemed that about half the police force had stopped by while I was sleeping, all of them bearing gifts in the shape of liquor bottles. They were following an old police tradition resembling an Irish wake. My kitchen counter was covered with these presents. Jenny grabbed my arm and said, "I'm not letting you touch a drink. You've come too far from what you were when you first took me in to backslide again." I nodded and left the kitchen. The judge followed me out. She said, "We've never been properly introduced. My name is Maria, and I hope to be your friend too." Then she gave me a 1,000-watt smile and hugged me. We all sat in the living room and got acquainted. Todd was the only one to meet the judge before, so Jenny and I had a lot to learn. Maria explained that she was a widow. Her husband died about 10 years ago of cancer. After his death, she used her knowledge of child physiology to win a seat in juvenile court. She loved her job. She took a special interest in Todd and was impressed at how I had turned him around. She asked Jenny about her story, but Jenny wouldn't open up. When Jenny wasn't looking, I signaled the judge not to continue. I talked to her about Jenny later. Maria had heard about Sharon's death on the evening news. She felt that Todd might need her to help cope with this tragedy and adjourned her cases for a week and caught a plane back east. She had gone directly from the airport to the cemetery. She arrived just in time to see me fall to my knees. She realized then that Todd wasn't the only one in trouble. Jenny had installed Maria in the guest bedroom suite and made sure that it was understood Maria was with us until her return flight next week. We talked all afternoon, only being interrupted by people stopping to offer their condolences. Jenny stayed by my side, turning down all offers to me of a drink. She explained that I was giving a sedative and not allowed to mix it with alcohol. She lied, but I allowed her to. She was looking out for my best interests. I could see Maria take note of this action. We were all exhausted and elected to eat out at a small Italian restaurant in the neighborhood. We had a quiet dinner, each of us lost in our own thoughts. When we got home, the kids went to their rooms and Maria and I sat in the den and talked. We chatted a while to just get acquainted when I felt her switch to the doctor mode. Her questions became probing and open-ended. So I started telling her about Sharon and me. I explained that we were just partners and there was nothing romantic between us. She had no relatives in the area, so she adopted my kids as hers, and we did things as a family. My kids were very happy with her and wanted me to start a relationship with her. I then told Maria about my 3 previous partners all being killed and how I warned Sharon and tried to get unpartnered with her before it happened to her. "Now about Jenny," was all she said. I told her Jenny's story. It took almost 2 hours before she said, "Let's stop now. I have enough to digest." She took my hand and pulled me onto my feet. I got a very long hug from her. If I didn't mention it before, I'm 6 feet 1 inch tall and about 220 pounds. Maria was about 5 feet 9 inches, the perfect height for me to hug. I took advantage of that fact because she just felt good in my arms. She looked into my eyes and slowly shook her head. "No." We walked upstairs to the bedrooms, me to mine and her to the guest suite. I wanted to follow her into hers, but I didn't. We had a good week. She and Jenny bonded and were soon joined at the hip. Todd introduced Maria to all his friends. Me? I went back to work. On Sunday, we all joined and took her to the airport for her return flight to Oregon. As she and I were hugging goodbye, I whispered in her ear, "You're always welcome in my home. Please take advantage of that to visit us again." She smiled and hugged just a little harder. Maria looked at her calendar. Somehow she had managed to keep the last 2 weeks in December and the first 3 weeks of January open. For some reason, she didn't want to spend the holidays alone. She thought back to her visit with Percy's family. It was a terrible week for them following Sharon's death, but she had helped them heal. She spent quiet time with both kids helping them grieve, but she liked her time sitting on the couch with Percy. It had been over 10 years since her husband died. Somehow Percy was filling the hole in her heart that the death of her husband caused. She made up her mind and started dialing the phone. About a week into December, the phone on my desk rang. "Detective Holmes, homicide," I answered. "Well, that's a nice greeting. You must be mellowing in your old age," said a familiar voice. "Hi, Maria. Long time no see." "Well, I'm going to try and remedy that little item," she replied. "I have cleared my calendar for the last 2 weeks in December and the first 3 weeks of January." Before she could continue, I interrupted. "What time does your flight arrive, and do you want me to tell Todd and Jenny?" "I haven't booked my flight or a hotel yet," answer 1. "And I'd like to surprise them," answer 2, was her response. "No hotel, you will stay with us. And it's not up for discussion," I replied as sternly as possible. I heard a small laugh on the other end of the line. "Okay, but no necking on the couch." "I never even tried," I exclaimed. "But it doesn't mean you didn't think about it," she laughed. "Caught you wishing you know." We discussed the logistics of her trip and finally broke off our call. That night I started cleaning up the house. Both the kids thought I was nuts, but chipped in and helped. My answer to all the work was, "It's Christmas and we might have people stopping in." I guess they bought it because they stopped asking questions. We spent the next 2 weeks shopping for groceries, Christmas decorations, and New Year's Eve stuff. I wanted Maria to enjoy her stay with us. And since this was our first time in the new house over the holiday season, I wanted to impress the kids. Jenny was enrolled in a local community college, but they had the holiday season off, so she was a great help shopping. She and I picked out all kinds of stuff for Todd to open Christmas morning. I shopped with Todd in the evening or after school and picked out all kinds of stuff for Jenny. It was looking as if it was going to be a very nice Christmas. Maria called and gave me her itinerary. Maria was like a little kid at their first Christmas. She shopped for presents for everyone. She overspent. She stayed up nights wrapping and rewrapping the gifts until she felt they were perfect. When the day came to leave, she arrived at the airport 3 hours early. She walked up and down the concourse until her flight was called. She was seated in first class and was ready to take off before they had coach loaded. She had it bad. When her plane finally landed about 2 weeks later, or so it seemed to her, she was first down the ramp. As soon as she reached the end of the ramp, she saw him. That great big goof had pulled rank on the TSA guys at be right there for her arrival. She had all she could do to keep from running up to him and jumping into his arms. But when she finally managed to reach him, she found her arms around his neck. She wasn't sure how they got around his neck, but they felt like they belonged there. To regain control of her emotions, she popped a wise crack. Percy found himself standing at the arrival gate at the appropriate airline. I had used my pull with the TSA guys to get through the checkpoint and wait for her at the gate. She smiled when she saw me and I got a great big hug. Seeing you standing there on the wrong side of the checkpoint tells me you pulled rank on those poor guys, she smiling said. I took her carry-on and said, "Yeep." We picked up her luggage and walked out to my car. On the way to my house, we caught up on the current events in our lives. I told her that I had done some shopping for the kids, and I wanted her to look over the presents and pick out which one she wanted to put her name on. She started laughing and said, "So did I. Those kids will have a great Christmas." Arriving at home, we unloaded her stuff and I carried it up to the guest suite. While she got unpacked, I started dinner. When the kids got home, I had dinner ready, so I asked them to get seated while I dished it out. As I was dishing it out, Maria came around the corner. "Anybody going to say hello?" she asked. Well, I thought Todd and Jenny were going to knock over the dinner table, trying to get to Maria. They asked all their questions so rapidly that they ran together, and none got answered until I shouted, "Enough! Finish your dinner. We'll talk after we eat." After we ate and cleaned up, I dragged all three of them out to the local Boy Scout Christmas tree sales location. I figured that I'd just pick out one from the pile and we'd be set. Boy, was I wrong. We looked at every tree they had there, some of them twice, before their minds were made up. I sat with some of the fathers of the Scouts drinking hot coffee and telling tales. It took about 2 hours before a tree was selected, and $100 later it was tied on the roof of my car. The tree didn't actually cost that much, but I wanted to add a little to the coffee fund. I figured that I had drunk at least $20 worth, and my bladder agreed. But the time we got back home, it was 9 p.m., too late to start decorating a tree. Since it was Friday night, I informed them that we would put up the tree tomorrow. Saturday morning, I got up about 9:30 a.m. and found everyone else decorating the tree in the house. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat in the living room and watched. It was a great feeling. Later that morning, I was informed that there were some more decorations I needed to get before the house was perfect. So off we went to a Christmas store. $200 later, my family said we could go home. Now I had my work cut out for me. I climbed the ladder and put up all the outside decorations with the help of my son, while inside Maria and Jenny finished up the decoration to the tree and the rest of the house. The girls also managed to prepare a great dinner. After dinner was cleaned up, we all sat in the living room and admired our handiwork. Soon it was just Maria and I sitting there as the kids went up to their rooms to do their own thing. I got up and went into the kitchen. I put on a tea kettle for tea. While I waited for it to boil, I poured Maria a glass of red wine. I picked red because she had picked up that bottle while we were shopping and I figured she must like it. When I delivered her glass, I got a nice smile. When I came back in the room with my tea, she really looked at me funny. So I thought I'd better explain to her why. Jenny has asked me not to drink. The smell forces her to relive those terrible months at the hands of her captors. I guess the smell reminds her of those poor souls hanging next to her waiting to be butchered. I said softly, "We need to get her some help," was her only reply. We sat side by side on the couch, both lost in our thoughts. I don't know how long we sat there like that, but I felt her head settle on my shoulder and her hand join with mine. For the first time in years, I felt contented. The 11 p.m. news was just finishing up when Maria lifted her head and looked into my eyes. I felt that we were going to kiss. I was wrong. She squeezed my hand and stood up. She took my teacup and her wine glass into the kitchen. "I don't know about you, but it's past my bedtime," she said, returning to the living room. I stood up and turned off the tree and shut down the TV. When I got finished, I found her waiting for me at the foot of the stairs. We climbed the stairs hand in hand and walked to her room. Outside her door, she put her arms around my neck and said, "Thank you for letting me join your family." She then kissed me softly on the lips, turned and entered her room. She closed the door behind her. Standing in the hall, I heard, "No, Percy. Please go to bed, it's too soon." I had a hard time going to sleep that night. My mind was a mess. It was the first time in a long time I didn't want to sleep along. I was wide awake. It was 3 a.m. and all I could think about was Percy's kiss outside my bedroom door. It had lit a fire in my belly that I hadn't felt since I buried my husband 10 years ago. Telling Percy no was the toughest thing I had ever done. I wanted him in my bed with every pore in my body. The sun was starting to rise when I finally drifted off to sleep. The days leading up to Christmas were hectic. There were last-minute gifts, parties to attend, and all the things that make Christmas Christmas. When Christmas Eve finally arrived, everybody brought their present to each other. The floor around the tree was full. I guess everybody went a little overboard. As we were opening our gifts, I saw rather than heard a car sneaking into the driveway. I waited about 15 minutes and invited Todd and Jenny out the front door. While they were getting on their coats, I snuck into the kitchen and turned on the driveway floodlights. All of a sudden, I heard the screams form outside. I guess they discovered their big presents. I had bought 2 cars from the police impound lot. They weren't the best, but they were cheap and both kids loved theirs. Todd would use his to be a teenager and Jenny would use hers to drive to her classes at our local college and the mall. Maria and I stood in the snow and watched the 2 kids. They were running back and forth telling each other what their car had. Maria put her hand in mine and said, "You continue to amaze me. Put your arm around me, it's cold out here." I did as she ordered. 1, because it was cold out here, and 2, I liked the way she felt. After we were completely chilled, Maria dragged me into the kitchen. She made hot chocolate for the 4 of us. I eventually had to lay down the law to get the kids back in the house. Something about the fact that I still had the car keys turned the trick. Once we were settled in the living room, we went back to opening our presents. There was a large shirt box with Todd's name on it from Maria. When Todd opened them, he found a bunch of legal documents. He handed them to me to translate. I glanced over at Maria and she was just beaming. I started the examination of the paperwork. On top of the pile was a document declaring that Todd had completed his sentence and all the records of his juvenile crimes are now sealed. The second document was a declaration by Todd's mother, turning all parental rights over to me and relinquishing her rights. I checked and both the documents were signed by Maria as the presiding judge. I looked at her and mouthed, "Thank you." I explained to Todd what all those papers did. When I finished, he was crying and hugging Maria so hard I swear she started to turn blue. Then he got serious. "Does this mean you'll no longer be in my life?" "Todd, I will always be there for you until you no longer want me there. Then I'll start spying on you," she said with a great big smile. "Will you join us for Christmas next year and at my graduation?" he asked. "As long as your father wants me here," was her answer. I just smiled at her and nodded, yes. I noticed that when most of the presents were opened, I snuck up to my bedroom to get Maria's gift. When I handed it to her, she got a funny look on her face because the bag it was in came from a local jewelry store. The box in the bag was too big for a ring box. As she looked at it, she looked relieved by its size, but also she looked disappointed by its size. She opened it and found the jeweled earring and matching necklace staring back at her. Her eyes started to tear up as she looked at me and mouthed, "Thank you." I leaned across the couch and quickly kissed her. "Merry Christmas, darling," I whispered. She ran out of the room, and we could hear her bedroom door slam. I guess I screwed up. Both of the kids were concerned about her. I asked them to give her a little personal time. They gave her about half an hour before visiting her room. It took about an hour, but the kids finally returned. "She's okay now, Dad. She just needs a little quiet time," was their answer to my look. They said goodnight and left me sitting in a darkened room. I soon tired and went to bed. Maria felt all the hurt of her husband's death return when she opened Percy's gift. The hurt was now compounded by her feelings for Percy. She had her loyalty to her dead husband and her new love for Percy. She had to leave the room before she broke down and ruined everyone's Christmas. She ran into her bedroom and threw herself on the bed. She cried her heart out. I found myself being held by Jenny and Todd. They were telling me I was safe, and no one would hurt me as long as their dad had anything to do with it. The 3 of us rested on my bed. It was like a big group hug. I never felt so loved in my entire life. I guess I must have dozed off because it was quiet in the house when I opened my eyes. I got off the bed and started getting undressed. I heard Percy walk by my door and go into his bedroom. I knew what I had to do. As I was getting undressed, I heard a soft knock on my door. Thinking it was one of the kids, I tossed on a robe and opened the door. Maria was standing there in her housecoat with very red eyes. She looked as if she had been crying very hard for a long time. "Can I come in? I want to explain," she asked. I stepped aside and invited her in, closing the door behind her. She sat on my bed and started. "Just before my husband lost his battle with cancer, he bought me a matched set of earrings and necklace. When I saw your gift, it brought back all the pain from that time. Please hold me and make the pain go away." I took her in my arms, and we just sat on the bed and hugged. After wait a short time, from my perspective, she jumped up and walked to my mirror. From her pocket, she pulled out the earrings I had given to her and put them on, and turned to face me. She pulled the zipper open and the housecoat and let it drop. All she had on were the earrings and the necklace. "Please be gentle. You're the first since my husband died," she asked. "We had a great night together. No one had ever given me such a nice Christmas present." We awoke early and made love again before taking a shower together and dressing for breakfast. Todd and Ginny were sitting at the breakfast table. Both of them looked like the Cheshire Cat from Alice in Wonderland because of their smiles. Maria and I blushed. Ginny took her hand and said, "Welcome to our family." Todd patted me on the back and whispered, "Attaboy, Dad." After we finished breakfast, Todd and Ginny announced they were going to visit friends and wouldn't be back until dinner time. "Want us to call first before we return?" they asked. Maria blushed again. Maria and I spent until 3 p.m. in my bed. I guess we were trying to catch up on lost time. I was exhausted and she was walking funny, but we were both head over heels in love. Percy was taking a nap after the 3rd time that day we had made love. I lay there watching him sleep. He was my man and I loved him. I knew that we were both too old to start another family, but it would be fun trying. She let her thoughts drift to resigning her judgeship and what she would move here to his house. She looked back to the man she loved and decided that he had had enough sleep. When New Year's Eve rolled around, Maria and I found ourselves at the chief's house for his important people New Year's Eve party. And all the important people were there. As I looked around, I started pointing out all the local politicos to Maria. "Why are we here?" asked Maria. "You don't run in these circles. I'd rather be back in your bed. It's a lot more fun. We'll leave early," I promised. We did. Maria and I brought in the new year in bed. It was a sad time around my house when Maria had to return to Oregon, but she did promise to return for Todd's high school graduation in June. I promised to try and visit her in Oregon frequently. It was February and I was feeling low because I missed Maria when my phone rang. It was the crime lab. "You want to come down here and look at this?" said a familiar voice. I signed myself out and drove over to their building. "What's up?" were the first words out of my mouth. "Look at this." I was pointed to a microscope. There I found myself looking at 2 identical bullets. "So?" I questioned. "The left one is from the club shooting, the right one from the site where Sharon died," was the answer I received. They came from the same gun. I had trouble wrapping my head around that fact. The club shooting and the site where Sharon died were related. I looked at the tech and said, "Don't let these get lost. Something really big is going on here. Let's keep this under our hats." And I added, "This makes 2 fishy happenings with the club case." On the way back to my office, I started running the facts around in my head. 1. There was a drug-related gangland shooting in an upscale club. 1 victim was shot more times than was normal for this type of shooting. The task force claimed a drug kingpin was the target, but this woman, who happened to be in the process of divorcing an important politician, received more gunshots than the kingpin. She wasn't sitting that near him. 2. A newspaper reporter who revealed these facts was killed in an auto accident. The accident occurred on a lonely country road. There were no witnesses. The car caught fire and burned. The only way they could identify the body was through dental records. It was a very hot fire. The CSI techs on the scene felt there was something wrong with the crime scene, but couldn't put their fingers on exactly what. 3. 1 bullet from the club murders and 1 bullet from the murder scene we were investigating when Sharon was killed were from the same gun. Somehow these crimes were connected. It felt as if someone was eliminating people who knew too much. I got a headache trying to fit the pieces together. I got back to my squad room and started going through all the files from all 3 cases looking for anything could find. I went home that night stumped, but I was determined to catch them. They had killed my partner. Valentine's Day rolled around. Jenny informed me that a guy she met in college had asked her to go with him to a party. I said she could go, but I'd like to meet the guy who wanted to take my daughter out. "Okay, but he said that he already knew you," was her answer. I started running all the college-age waiters, busboys, and grocery baggers I knew through the prism of my mind. No one stood out as acceptable. When the doorbell rang, I was surprised to find Dean Beggy, the local patrol officer, standing at my front door. He was wearing a suit and carrying a box of candy and some flowers. He stood there looking nervous as hell. "I suspect that those flowers and candy are for me?" I commented. His face registered panic. Then I smiled and said, "I was only kidding. Come on in," I said. You could see him start to breathe again. "So where did you meet my daughter?" I inquired. "We are both taking classes at college and met in one of them," was his answer. "Okay. Do you remember when I first moved in out here and I said that there was someone looking for me?" He nodded. "Well, it's Jenny he's after. It was that serial killer from last year. Are you carrying your gun?" I asked. He shook his head no. We walked into my study and opened the gun safe. I handed him my .50 cal Desert Eagle, 2 clips and a holster. "Put it on," I instructed. While he was putting the holster on and loading the clip into the butt, I continued. "He really big, about 6 feet 8 inches and 300 pounds. One shot won't stop him. Empty the clip into him. Remember, he's crazy and won't stop until dead, so none of the usual cop warnings. Just kill him," I added. Jenny was coming down so we broke off the conversation and walked into the living room to grate her. She lit up like a 1,000-watt light bulb when she saw Dean. I smiled at them and walked them to the door. As they were leaving, I said, "Have fun, but don't do anything that I wouldn't do." Jenny started to reply when she suddenly turned red. I guess she was remembering Maria and I at Christmas. "Dad," was the response I got. About 11 p.m., I called Maria on the West Coast. I got the answering machine and left a message that I missed her. At 3 a.m., my phone went off. At first, I thought it was one of the kids in trouble, so I grabbed it and yelled, "Where are you?" "I'll be right there." "Home in bed." "Do you promise to come right over?" Maria's voice said. "I love you," was my answer. We talked until the sun rose in my time zone. No, we didn't have phone sex, but we did talk about some of the things we were going to do the next time we met, and there was a bed handy. I made up my mind to take a vacation as soon as possible. I wanted Maria in my arms again. The crime rate was at low ebb now. It was winter, and it was just too nasty for even criminals to go out. So I was sitting in at my desk thinking. Well, not exactly thinking. I was reading the sports section of the newspaper when the business section of the paper fell on the floor. I picked it up and noticed an article about our local senator. It seems he was embroiled in a lawsuit against his late wife's trust fund. He was trying to get control of her $100 million trust. It seems that she was the only heir to her family fortune. The trustees were resisting his efforts. As I sat there reading the article, I remembered she was one of the victims at the club shooting. She was the one who had been shot too many times, in my opinion, for a bystander. I think I had just discovered a reason to kill her. To be exact, 100 million reasons. I started pulling some of the files out of storage to have another look. This time I reread the reports with a different perspective. When the killings first took place, everyone was working under the assumption that it was drug-related because a drug kingpin was killed. But what if he wasn't the target? What if the senator's wife was? That trust fund was one hell of a motive. I'm not a financial guy. I'm lucky I can add 22 and get 4. But I have a friend that is. In my earlier years, I had helped catch the killer of his father. The killer was a lowlife who was trying to rob his father. The father fought back and received 2.32 specials in the belly. I did my job and caught the lowlife, who got life. The son never forgot my involvement and became my money manager when I got the award from my ex-wife's lawyer. I don't understand how he accomplished it, but I now had a couple of million in my account. My original plan was to retire from police work and buy a hunting/fishing camp in the woods someplace and take up a new career. My plan was put on hold when I suddenly became a father with a home to support and 2 kids. I had 23 years with the force and I was ready to retire. I was tired of all the senseless violence. There were only 2 cases I wanted to solve. I wanted to kill the man who had kidnapped my Jenny, and I wanted to solve the club shooting. Did I say I was planning on taking justice into my own hands with Jenny's kidnapper? Damn right I did. No goody 2 shoes was going to save him from what he so rightly deserved. I put my hand on my .50 cal handgun and just rubbed it a little. I pulled myself out of my revengeful daydream and placed a call to my financial guy. When he answered, I asked him to lunch. We agreed to meet at a fancy restaurant near his office at 1 o'clock the next day. When I arrived at the restaurant the next day, I was a little early. The maitre decided that I wasn't the type of customer that belonged in his restaurant. I looked at that little 5 feet 6 inches creep and started to pull his chain. This was a very expensive French restaurant, and I wasn't dressed in the required $1,000 suits and other fancy clothes. I was in my wrinkled cop clothes and unshined shoes. I opened my coat and put my badge on my belt. My gun was now in plain view. He started to back away. I grabbed him by his skinny arm and pulled him back right in front of me. Where the hell do you think you're going? I yelled. The restaurant got quiet. He wet himself. I let him go and pushed him away with a look of disgust on my face about the time the owner arrived from his office. He took one look at me and yelled, "Hi, Percy. Where you been? I haven't seen you in ages." I had helped one of his employees once. He never forgot. "Working," I replied. I decided to stop in and get a burger or maybe a ham and cheese sandwich. He started laughing and put his arm around my shoulders. The restaurant returned to normal. One of the waiters filled in for the match read that day. The owner and I sat at a small table in the rear of the dining room. We chatted about our lives until my financial guy showed up. When our waiter showed up, the owner said, "No check for Detective Holmes and his party, ever." He bid us goodbye and left to go back to running his business and hiring a new match read. My financial guy, John Gilbert, and I caught up on stuff since we last met. We had a great lunch. Over coffee, John asked, "Okay, Percy, I know this meeting isn't about your portfolio, so what's up?" "John, I have a tough case, and I need some help looking into where the money comes from." I replied. "No problem, I'm always willing to help," he replied. "John, this is a bad one. Besides the original collateral damage, there were also 2 people killed who were investigating the crime. I think there might be a dirty cop and a dirty politician involved," was my statement. "So? This sounds like fun. You need to be very careful that no one finds out you are looking. I don't want to lose a good friend." I pleaded. "I understand. So let's hear about it," was his answer. We spent the next hour drinking the fine coffee and discussing the case. He said he'd look into the senator's money and get back to me. I went back to my desk. I had a few other things to check, and I wanted to create a CYA file. If I got killed, I wanted someone else to know my feelings about this case. Revenge from the grave was not my first choice, but it was better than nothing. That night at home, the kids noticed that I was unusually quiet. They tried to cheer me up, but failed. I just had too much on my mind. Later that evening, I made up my mind to call my attorney and update my will. I had a bad feeling about this case. I was in the squad room extra early the next morning. There were some more files I wanted to check before anyone came into work that morning. The first thing I did was change some of the case file numbers to the serial killer's case number. That way, anyone quickly looking at the files on my desk would think I was working on the serial killer case. They would actually need to open the files and read them before realizing that I had altered the number. One of the folders contained all the information concerning the case where my partner Sharon was killed. I wanted to look at the information on the murdered guy we found there. The coroner's report indicated that the man had been shot once in the back of the head, execution style. I could find no identification of who he was. There was no ID on the body. Fingerprint searches proved negative. DNA searches also returned no results. The only positive result came from the dental pathologist. His report indicated that the victim's teeth had fillings that were European. I checked the paperwork. For some reason, no one had asked Interpol to check their records. My problem was how to contact Interpol without anyone local finding out. I thought about that problem off and on until I went to lunch. I was sitting at the counter having lunch when I overheard 2 guys discussing computer security and hacking into European systems. That started the wheels turning in my head. I was barely computer literate, but I knew someone who was an expert. I stopped at a payphone and called a computer hacker I knew. I left a message to meet me tomorrow at a very private location. He was very paranoid about meetings. He felt that the government was after him. I planned to use this phobia to my advantage at our meeting. I went back to my office to make copies of the information I thought he might need to locate this victim. The next day we met and exchanged information. I warned him about my feelings about the dirty cop. 2 days later, a message window popped up on my computer at work. It said, "Your computer and phone are bugged. Be careful." Now I was glad my friend was paranoid. Unfortunately, now I was too. I stopped on my way home at a supermarket and bought a few items as a cover. I also used their payphone to set up another face-to-face meeting with the hacker. The meeting was very productive. He explained that my office PC had a small program that sent a file containing all my email to another system. There was also another program that logged all my keystrokes if I was referencing certain case numbers. He gave me a list of the case numbers. I recognized them as all being related to the club murders. I asked him to find out where the information from my bugs was being sent since it was related to the work he was doing for me. His eyes got really big. I guessed I was reinforcing his paranoia. I also asked him to check my home systems. When I offered him my home security system access codes, he just smiled and said, "Thanks, but I don't need them." About 1 week later, a message window popped up on my office PC. It said, "Meet me. Don't drive your car. It has a tracking device on it." After lunch the next day, my battery was suddenly dead when I tried to start my car. I called in to the desk sergeant and explained my problem. Then I took a bus to Sears to buy another battery. On the bus, I found the hacker sitting in a seat waiting for me. When I tried to sit next to him, he stood up and walked off the bus. I found a small piece of paper on the seat. It told me to get off the bus at a certain stop and walk to an auto repair shop. The shop owner, after hearing my car problems, sent me with a tow truck driver to get my car. Guess who the driver was? That's correct, my friend the hacker. We had a good talk on the trip. When we got back to the garage, they brought my car inside and showed me the tracking device and a voice recorder under my seat. While they were checking my electrical system, there was some problem with the test equipment and it sent an over-voltage surge through my system. My fuses blew, protecting my stuff. The voice recorder and the tracker were not protected by my fuses. They were fried. There were bunches of high fives in the garage. I asked them to check my kids' cars. Jermaine sat there in the darkness. He was watching the illegals sneaking into the country. It was a strange route that had taken him from his parents' farm to here in Texas. He remembered seeing his sister's body lying on the floor of the room. The young girl that he wasn't allowed to have sex with was gone. He was mad at his sister because now he wouldn't be able to hear the girl's screams as he assaulted her. He had waited so long and now she was gone. He knew that he would have to leave the farm. The girl would notify the police and they would come looking. He hated his sister even more. As she was sprawled there on the floor in a pool of her blood and brains, he found himself getting hard. Movement across the field pulled him back from those pleasant memories. His eyes, having adjusted to the darkness, allowed him to see the small family crossing the desert alone. They were not in the large groups he normally saw. They were headed in the direction of his traps. Soon they would be his prey. He couldn't wait to start butchering them. As he waited, he thought about the teenage girl he and his sister kept for years. He wanted her back. Someday he would return and hunt her down. She probably killed his sister, and he wanted revenge. He was thinking about how much fun he would have with her when he heard the first of his traps snap closed and the family scream. He hurried over to the trap to keep the family from attracting any undue attention. Soon they would be his to enjoy. He would kill the man first. He would scatter the body pieces across the desert so that the animals could finish up eating the family. This would be a good week for him. At the same time, Percy was closing in on the club killings. His buddy, the financial guy, found out that the senator was actually broke. He needed his ex-wife's trust fund to stay ahead of the bill collectors. He was living way beyond his means. Worse, he was borrowing from a South American drug king to keep his head above water. I'll bet the drug king has the senator right in his pocket. The senator may not realize it yet, but he was no longer his own man. He belonged to a drug lord, lock, stock, and barrel, thought Percy. This is the motive for the killings. Next, the computer guy came through. Somehow he hacked into Interpol's database. The dead guy was an Italian killer. He was listed as a contract agent for hire. Their records indicated that it was suspected that he was killed in a vendetta about 6 months before Percy found his body. He had a male lover, another killer who just happened to be a distant cousin of the senator. There's the connection, thought Percy. Now how do I prove that the senator was involved? Percy started to push at the connections, hoping that someone would break. A couple of weeks later, Percy had an idea. He sent an email to one of the state guys, who was on the task force, explaining all about the killer and his friend and their connection to the senator. Percy knew that his email would be captured by the spy software on his PC and sent to someone. He expected someone to try to silence him. He was going to be ready. A couple of days went by before he got a warning. Message window popped up on his PC telling him not to start his car. A bomb was rigged to his car. He had had a remote car starter installed on his car. He had the remote installed so that he would be able to start the car from within the house and let it warm up before driving. Since it was February and cold out, he announced that he was going to warm up his car before going outside. The guys in the squad room suspected that he was bragging and gave him a hard time. He walked to a window overlooking the parking lot. He made sure no one was around his car that might get hurt. Then he pushed the buttons. The car exploded just as he had expected. A couple of hours later, he was still at work reviewing the parking lot surveillance tapes. They spotted the guy who had installed the bomb. They didn't get a good picture of him, but he matched the description of the second killer. Percy put a bolo out on him with the armed and dangerous warning. He also listed that the man was wanted for his involvement in a cop killing. Percy knew that the officers who found him would be extra vigilant. I guess they were too vigilant. 24 hours later, the killer was cut down in a shootout with 14 officers responding to the bolo.